Hello and welcome to The Gaggle. And today, myself and George are joined by a very delightful, long sought after guest, Mr. Viva Fry, or David Freiheit, who is a Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and he provides legal breakdowns of current events. Very honoured and lucky to have you on The Gaggle tonight, David. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Today.
Good evening to you. I guess we're 6 hours apart.
We are 6 hours apart. The day is past and yours is only just beginning.
Well, you're going to have a long night because the developments in what's going on in the States, they're coming in too fast to keep up with. And the most difficult thing is just making sure that the information you're getting is accurate.
Yes, this is the reason for your invite onto this show, because David, I have a lot of questions and I am seeking some kind of answers which you may or may not be able to provide. But David, what do you think? Actually, sorry, I should call you Viva. I think that's more suitable.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, Viva's good.
Get confused here. But Viva, please tell me, what developments are on your top kind of watch list right now? What are you most concerned about from the past, what's it been, 3 days since election night already?
Yeah, two and a half days. There's the tiers of, I wouldn't call it concern, because concern implies sort of emphasis of desire, but in terms of what to follow, the obvious one is the electoral college count, because right now, depending on which site you're going to, they've some news agencies have declared certain states which others haven't. Bottom line, Biden is closer to 270 than is Trump at this point, but they haven't called for some reason they haven't called Alaska. Last I checked, they haven't called Wisconsin, Nevada, Pennsylvania.
I think they. Sorry to interrupt. They have called Wisconsin. They haven't called Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina, and Alaska, as you say.
Okay, so those will tip the balance. Mm-hmm. Those might be determinate in terms of the electoral college number. Yeah. That's the top tier. The next tier is the number is not going to matter at this point because lawsuits are going to be going to court. And so even if Biden gets over the 270, there's going to be lawsuits contesting the validity of the elections in certain states and the swing states by and large. Right now, there's active lawsuits in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and I believe Wisconsin they also filed. And so this is where I'm following, because the numbers are one thing, but the numbers are not going to be determinate until the lawsuits are determinate. In Michigan, they just filed suit the day before yesterday I read the suit today, is basically just to allow the observers to observe properly, and that, the allegations are that the observers are being denied access as required under the law. The remedy is going to be something else because it's going to be longer term remedy. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, they were just in the Court of Appeal to have the lower court decision overturned, which didn't deny them access, but which didn't grant them closer access than that which was already being provided, which if you don't have close access, it's no access at all. So these are the lawsuits that I'm following. And then after that, then it's just, I don't want to say chatter, but for lack of a better word, it's chatter. It's everybody sharing stories, sharing videos of what they think to be fraud, noteworthy videos. And then there's just gossip. So first tier, second tier, chatter, gossip.
But now it comes something very interesting. And it was actually raised in the discussion you had the other night with Barnes, which is that even if, let's say, Biden wins, Trump loses in all the courts, because the chances are he will lose. The courts don't like overturning vote counts. Then you get to the issue of the electors, and those electors are actually selected by state legislatures, and the Republicans control the state legislatures in all of those states which are in contention. And then you've got another electors being selected, which is by the US House of Representatives. And there, again, the Republicans are in control, because although they are in a minority, they actually they have a majority of the state delegations. Then you have the 50 state delegation. I think Republicans have 26, Democrats have 24. So even if the courts go against Trump, Trump still has this option, which is the selection of the electors.
So that's an interesting thing. Like that is not something that's within my expertise by any means. Robert and I discussed it during the stream last night, and as a layperson, people tend to think, okay, the news calls the election and that's it, it's done. but you have the process where it gets vetted by the actual government, and it's not the case that the electoral college votes have to go the way of the vote within that state,
Right.
which is an interesting thing that Robert was explaining. But I mean, can you imagine if the courts don't overturn an election, and like you say, that they wouldn't want to overturn it, it would just be a question of issuing an order that certain ballots be counted or certain ballots be excluded from the count, and would that affect the final number? Yeah, there's other levels of remedy, for lack of a better word, but geez, I mean, by that point, you know, there would be some serious social political upheaval if, you know, if the government refused to recognize that which the courts refuse to overturn of the results which people are, you know, one way or another are never going to have faith in.
Right, but if the Republicans think that this has been stolen, the election has been stolen, we will not seat these electors, and that could happen because one can imagine Trump will start lobbying the state legislatures, and then he could start lobbying the Republican congressmen about what happens to seat the electors of the House of Representatives. So, I mean, if you listen to Steve Bannon on his podcast, Bannon was saying on January the 22nd, Donald Trump will be inaugurated president of the United States. So whether it'll be decided in the courts or whether it'll be decided in the US House of Representatives, Donald Trump will be inaugurated president of the United States. Well, so and his path is the path that was outlined by Barnes in his discussion with you.
Well, so someone had flipped me that article. It was Stephen Bannon's position of the 14th Amendment, as we discussed with Barnes. I couldn't even pretend to have enough knowledge or insight into this to go down that path. I just say that, I mean, Barnes's explanation was along those lines, is that they do not have to recognize the vote of the population when granting the electoral college, and if they're thoroughly convinced it was a defective process, they have certain remedies at the political level above and beyond the courts. So I would defer anybody to that section of our discussion with Barnes last night, and we're probably going to bring it back up on Sunday. But no, for me right now, I can't even, we're not even going to get there for now, because we're going to have the next month of litigation, and there's going to be questions as to, you know, people already asking, you can't put the toothpaste back in the what's the expression? You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So it's all great that they say, yeah, in Pennsylvania, the Court of Appeal, and this was my tweet of the day, is in that one-page judgment, it says, yeah, grant them access within 6 feet, taking proper COVID measures. That implicitly recognizes that up until that point, they were not allowed within 6 feet of the counting.
Yeah.
And that's good. Now they get access granted, and apparently from Coleman, who is the lawyer's tweet just now, they're still being denied access. So there will be contempt orders, whatever. The damage will have been done to some extent. And this was what Robert and I had discussed, is like, what could be the remedies for the damage being done? And, you know, there is a possibility, Robert said it's not inconceivable, that the states can, in theory, be ordered to hold elections again. Which, wow. Can you imagine that? I mean, this is...
No, I don't want to imagine that. But also, Viva, I was wondering, it seems apparent to me that, you know, since as people were kind of expecting, I don't actually think that the pandemic response has hurt Trump as much as at least the Democratic Party expected it would.
This is it's not Monday morning quarterback. It's the hypotheticals that can never be proven nor disproven. Some people say, you know, any other candidate in a similar situation would have been utterly decimated. You know, the response to this and that. I don't know. You know, it's everything has become so polarized that even the response to the pandemic itself will embolden a base and, you know, probably have no swaying influence on anybody who didn't approve in the first place. But I think the pandemic, I think, is secondary, because in as much as it's been politicized in the United States, people have been suffering everywhere, so that can't be the determinant factor. But I think what I find absolutely mind blowing in terms of this competition for president is you have Biden, who it's not even arguably, he has the support and the backing of mainstream media, or at the very least 90% of the mainstream media, who has effective control or access to 90% of the population. He has the backing of big tech in terms of censoring, limiting the free flow of what most people consider to be relevant information. Biden has the support of Lady Gaga and celebrities, although Trump has his celebrities as well. And notwithstanding,
Little Pump, the rappers are behind Trump.
Lil Wayne, he had 50 Cent support until Chelsea Handler got him back in line with.
Yes.
But so, but with all of that, and I consider the big tech infrastructure and media to be the dominant factor, notwithstanding all of it, and notwithstanding all that influence, this is as close as they were able to get it in terms of moving the needle, which is just mind blowing, because it's just impressive in the sense that these are forces that are suffocating forces for anybody to even manage to get this close, and people still think it's being stolen at this close level. That is what I think is the truly amazing thing to take away from this election.
Yes, no, there's no question. And the fact was that despite all of the attacks of the Democrats on Trump, that somehow the death of 250,000 Americans is on him, he personally is responsible for the deaths of all these people. Despite all of that, it was a terrible night for the Democrats. Failed to capture the Senate, lost seats in the House, and as you say, they ran this candidate for the presidency, and despite everything, and you haven't even mentioned how much money that he has collected, far greater amounts than Donald Trump. Even with all of that, he really wasn't able to beat him in any convincing legal fashion, let's say.
Well, no, it's an amazing thing. It's sort of like it's 2016 2.0. I think Hillary had raised or spent a 1.4 billion compared to Trump's 1 billion back then. But the funny thing is, this is what the media just doesn't understand. We're in a point now, and it sort of explains why big tech really wants to rein in the free information on the internet. It's the democratizing of information for the people.
Yeah.
The harder they push with attempting to blame Trump for everything and anything. There was a violent incident or a racist incident in Newfoundland or Halifax, I forget which, the Maritimes of Canada, and the victim of the act alluded to the fact that it was somehow Donald Trump's fault in terms of the global impression that he's created and the global sentiment that he's created. But people are appreciating this, and the harder the media pushes to pin every negative thing on Trump, the harder more people pull back, and the harder the middle ground begins to realize that this is quasi-religious demonizing that is off-putting. And so I think it actually has the opposite effect. Specifically, everybody from Pete Buttigieg to all of the other supporters trying to blame Trump for the COVID deaths. Whereas I continually, it's not a partisan observation. You cannot blame Trump for the COVID deaths. Or the leader of the NDP party in Canada, Jagmeet Singh, did the same thing. You to blame that on Trump exclusively, there are certainly deficiencies everywhere, is to absolutely ignore the state independence. And it goes back to one of those lose-lose situations. If Trump imposes federal will on the states, he's infringing on state autonomy. And if he doesn't, he gets blamed for state failings like New Jersey, New York, I think it's Michigan or Pennsylvania as well, who are sending COVID positive patients back to nursing homes. Yeah. People are not that gullible. And the more they are treated like gullible people who should just, swallow what they're fed, the more some of them sort of push back.
Yeah. I think the more that they're treated as such, the more they gather respect for Trump himself as in a sympathetic gesture, perhaps.
Well, it's an amazing thing because, it's like we live in a world where if you're not anti-Trump, you're pro-Trump. And I consider myself just to observe it relatively from an outsider perspective. But there are people absolutely who say, like, who could have sustained this 4 years? I mean, I know that I couldn't. I can barely sustain, negative comments on YouTube. I say that tongue in cheek, but who could have sustained this, a negative press 95+% of the time, to still get a government that spent the better part of 4 years trying to remove him from office, undermine his presidency, as opposed to actually work to build the country, and manage to get certain things done, and manage to, we're going to see what happens, but manage to have it this close of an election. Although my prediction was way off. I said he was going to get 320 electoral college. I felt that.
320. 320.
If I'm doing the math, if I say all the swing states that could have gone, would have gone, then it would have been there. But I might have been overcompensating on the other end.
Yeah.
But we'll see how this goes. This is just.
What if it was stolen from him? Then he may well have got 320, because I think that Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. I think all three there's clear evidence of theft in all those cases. Well, but just going back to what you were saying about Trump. What he was accused of in the past 4 years is really the worst thing you can be accused of. First of all, the president of the United States is accused of being a traitor. He's accused of working on behalf of the government of a supposed adversary. I mean, I don't think it's an adversary, but nonetheless, Russia is deemed as an adversary of the United States. He's working on their behalf.
Is that my internet?
So these are the worst things, and not to lose your temper and really get angry is actually quite a feat that he's actually managed to retain a certain calmness of demeanor despite all these slurs on his character.
Well, my theory is that when these accusations have been so not just counterproductive but damaging, because they begin to dilute the value of what ought to be meaningful words. And it's true, they call it, first of all, everyone accusing him of treason, by and large doesn't understand the concept of treason, and they have no idea. They're just like throwing around the most damaging words, but racist, bigot, xenophobe. And I don't entertain these discussions because you can't have them remain rational for too long. But the most racist president in the history got the biggest gains in the Latino vote, substantial gains in the African American vote. The reality, people are not stupid. They see things with their own eyes, and when they're just being forced into, they're being bullied into having an opinion, they push back. And it's sort of the Streisand effect to some extent, but it's the pushback effect.
Yeah, I also think that's a massive effect of being force fed so many headlines incriminating Trump from the day one to throughout impeachment and whatever else that came next. There was not a moment of relief or even an inkling towards, actually maybe this guy is someone that we should encourage to actually take up the role of president and try and make him grow within that role, instead of constantly having to be on the defense all the time, the whole way through.
I have these discussions with people because I have discussions with people who hold different positions and ideologies, but I can understand people don't like him. I can understand he's abrasive. I can understand people hate him. But when I talk to people when it's vitriolic, and I say, I just say, do you think it's normal to hate anybody this much? The reality is, if people were to step back, they would appreciate it's not normal to hate anybody as much as a lot of people hate Donald Trump. And nobody reflects to say, how is it that I have been whipped into such an emotional state? And when you are somewhat detached, the answer is exquisitely obvious. It is incessant media indoctrination, just day in and day out. It begins to have an effect on anybody, however self-aware they are. But I think a lot of people became self-aware of that and just realized that the media is not reporting the news, incidentally, any more than the pollsters are trying to report on the polls. They are just trying to craft something for you to believe. Yeah. And the harder they push, they break some people, as you've seen, but the harder they push, other people pull back. And that explains the Trump phenomena.
But I feel like for this election itself, though, for me, it feels like which candidate you hate less. Let's pick which guy you can kind of hate less than the other guy, because both candidates have a lot to dislike about them. Although when you look at the media, Joe Biden has been cast as like the good guy, the old guy, the nice guy, the kind guy, versus a monster. But when you look at both of them objectively, there's things to dislike about both of them, and there's things to be passionate about both of them. So it seems to me this whole race has been, who do you hate less? That's who you should vote for.
Well, I
don't know if that's all fair.
I wouldn't quite put it like that, because Trump inspires two very intense emotions. I mean, he does inspire hatred, but he also inspires love. I mean, when the crowd starts chanting, "We love you," that is something extraordinary. I mean, and Trump is right to point out, even Ronald Reagan never got crowds to chant, "We love you." And I think that is an expression of love.
He's got a very small trajectory of love overall. With people who are chanting "We love you" is not a massive statistic in America overall.
Oh, I might disagree. I think I would say it's split 50-50. I think there are very few people who are indifferent to Trump. There might be some people who really hate him, but will still vote for him just on policy questions and on governance questions and on the reality that if as much of a fascist dictator as anybody thinks he is, he's been in power for 4 years and hasn't done what a fascist dictator would do with power for 4 years. But I think people genuinely love him. And I think people have almost like a faith in him in that. And it's weird. People may object to this qualification, especially mostly the haters, but people look at him as some form of resistance to what they are now realizing has been fundamental failings in their government system and their media system and their media empire. And they see him as the resistance, and which in turn means they view themselves as the resistance. And rightly so to some extent, as we have witnessed. And he has brought out all the flaws in the system, in the hypocrisy in the system, the corruption in the system. And even if you think he's a part of it or you think he's corrupt on his own, whatever, he has brought that all out, laid it so bare that nobody can deny it, which is why, people who hate him have to hate him even more, and why the institution has to hate him even more.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, and what you have is those people, those crowds that come to his rallies, I think they really do feel that we are treated as the great unwashed. We are the deplorables. We are the people who are despised by the Obamas and the Hillary Clintons of this world, and that Trump is somebody who has heard them. He will support them. He will protect them. He's on their side. And even if it fails at this, that, or the other, they still feel that Trump is on their side, in the way that they think Obama is not on their side, that Obama is quite happy to ship their jobs overseas, and he'll tell them, go learn to code. Forget about all this manufacturing industry. Those jobs are gone. Trump isn't like that. Trump just says, yeah, we're going to bring all this back to the United States. And I think that's a big difference. That they feel that he's on their side. He will protect them.
Well, there's no question about that. And it was Scott Adams in his book, Win Bigly, where he talks like, the deplorables insult became a badge of honor. And in a way, it didn't represent it to them. It did not represent a negative aspect of their identity. It became like it meant like the forgotten, where Hillary Clinton, when she used it, she wanted to she intended to designate certain people, whatever. But they took it as meaning everyone in between California and New York, the forgotten people who the politicians don't care about, have forgotten forever, and are not fighting for. And people do agree or disagree. The deplorables do view Donald Trump as being the last true politician to fight for the people and fight for America, as opposed to, bowing to what they call the New World Order, but a globalist agenda, that compromises their autonomy and independence and well-being as a nation to the benefit of a purported global community. And there's no question they see it. There's no question they feel a personal connection between them and Trump. And there's no question that they feel that there is no other politician out there who's going to so remorselessly and unapologetically represent their interests, even if it's unpopular on the international scheme.
Yeah.
But it's
sorry, continue.
No, I was going to say those rallies. Those are not. Nobody can do that. Nobody except for Trump can pull rallies like that. And people will judge the rallies. They'll judge the intelligence of the people in the rallies, because that's how everybody likes to feel good about themselves. There are people who feel a connection and who feel inspired, and which is why this is a debacle of an election, because they're never going to feel that it was fair, regardless of which way it goes. And even if Trump ekes out a win, it's going to confirm how broken the system is.
Yeah. So I was just about to say that, the most fervent of his faith, I proclaim him to be some kind of messiah, or at least view him as some kind of messiah figure, speaking on their behalf and their needs, and being a voice to people who have gone many, many years unheard, which is, I agree with you both, one of the most potentially magical aspects of Trumpism and Trump being the US president for these 4 years. But
and that's why, if they feel that this election has been stolen from them, then people get really angry. They get very upset. They reach for their guns. If you look at what happens in other countries, when suddenly they feel an election has been stolen, they rebel. They don't accept the authority of a new government. We saw that in what happened in Ukraine. Same thing, the same dynamic
and Belarus
everywhere.
Well, it's an interesting thing because it's not a hidden fact. For whatever the reason, a large portion of my subscriber base consider themselves conservatives, and even within that, and I follow the discussions, you have people who are exquisitely angry, and there's a concern that people get in when people feel that the system doesn't work. And what do? For a long time now, people have been feeling like the judicial system doesn't work. They've been feeling that it's been politicized to the point of weaponry. They feel that the government's been doing the same thing. So, but then the flip side is you have a very large portion who say, we'll fix the system. Violence is never the answer. And the reality is violence is never. Absolutely. Violence is not the answer because it degenerates to a point where it's as damaging to everybody. Mm-hmm. But you have people saying like, okay, there are big problems. The system is broken. We'll fix it. But before anybody gets there, work the courts in as much as you can. And that's it. But the general consensus, nonetheless, even within the base that I see online, is retain your dignity because you don't want to become like your enemy in trying to defeat your enemy.
No.
But it's interesting what you said about the courts, because here's an example of a court case that you've discussed a number of times with Barnes, which is the case of Michael Flynn. And there you can see, and I'm sure Trump's supporters, his diehard supporters, do follow that case quite closely. And they say, here is this case, which is a ridiculous cooked up case. And there is just no way that this 3-star general can get himself out of it. And it goes on and on and on. It's like a nightmare. And what's his crime? His ultimate crime was that he wanted to serve Donald Trump. That's all. That's his punishment, that this just goes through this relentless court case that's been going on for years.
We've been seeing, and I've been following that now for 8 months, and I pulled the full 180 because at the time I knew only that which was being reflected in the news. 30,000-foot headline overview. He pleaded guilty twice. He must be guilty. That has become is the word emblematic?
Emblematic, yeah.
An emblematic travesty, and it just keeps going, and you have a judge who is clearly biased, and I say clearly partisan at this point, will not let it go and will force a pardon so that they can claim a political victory as opposed to a judicial one. But forget Flynn. You saw the case out of Missouri with the McCloskeys. You can see what happens. The couple charged with brandishing firearms when protesters were, had broken down a fence and were marching through their private streets. When the processes that are otherwise supposed to be impartial and applied fairly become weaponized, people become not just disillusioned, they become scared. Like it's the process is weaponized by whomever's in power to weaponize it, and that's how things fall apart. The question is, how do you fix it to avoid meaningful degeneration into more than just protests? And we're getting to that point where people are going to have to ask themselves, how do you fix the system without breaking it more and without descending into chaos?
And how do you fix the system?
It's my personal view is you have to retain your own dignity and not become the enemy that you're fighting. And if it's a question of not necessarily turning the other cheek, but rather, dealing with it to some extent and tolerating it to some extent and taking the high ground maneuvers, that's what you have to do, even if it feels nauseating to do. But the becoming more evil than your adversary in order to defeat them, that's the land of the blind, because everybody's poking their eyes out.
That's right. And ultimately, if you resort to violence, the people on the other side have greater violence at their disposal. So the people who feel frustrated over Sullivan's treatment of Flynn, if they take matters into their own hands, the government is going to come at you and
that's the other thing that people don't necessarily appreciate in the dynamic is there's the provocation is not necessarily unintentional, and especially when the provocation just leads to more draconian measures, and it leads to the government using it as an excuse, or the parties who are committing the wrongs in the first place to say, look what we have to do now, you're making us do this. And that really is the ultimate spiral into madness. But that people have to be aware of that, and it is we'll see that. But you hope at the end of the day, the legal system gets it right at the higher levels, because Sullivan is I'm convinced that the Court of Appeal and Sullivan is now, like Barnes has said as well, they're looking down at Sullivan and regretting their decision. So you have to hope that as it filters up to the, I won't call them the bigger minds of the judicial world, but the higher courts, that the higher courts will take a higher standing and get it right. Typically it works, but on some issues you can see how it doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I thought that when the court initially, I mean, remember the DC Circuit actually ruled against Sullivan, and it seemed that's it, the case is over. And amazingly, I mean, Sullivan appealed, and that was reversed. I mean,
it was, now in fairness, because we say, you know, when the system gets weaponized, the DC court 2-1, 2 Republican judges versus 1 Democrat, you know, granted the mandamus and dismissed the case. Then Sullivan appeals it, and the court sua sponte, they ultimately conclude on their own motion, decide to hear it and overturn it. And incidentally, they overturn it, denying the mandamus to Michael Flynn. The same Court of Appeal in the Hillary Clinton case grants the mandamus. They find it's justified under the circumstances. And mandamus, for anybody who doesn't know, it's like an extraordinary court measure to order the lower court or a government body to do or to not do something. And so it's even funny. The same court can rationalize the conclusion they want depending on who's sitting on that panel. It is, but that's a problem. It's weird. In Canada, I don't think our courts, from my observations, they're nowhere near as politicized, but they might just do it more subtly or more politely as Canadians do things. In the States, it's palpable.
Yeah. But I think maybe that's one of the great things about, if we can take, I'll ask you both this question. If we can take something good out of 2020 to do with like system reform or people's eyes being open to something, I think that one of the greatest things to come out of 2020 is critical thinking being very heavily applied to the system itself. In the US particularly, and not just from a US introspective perspective, from a global perspective, I think there's been a lot of criticism and a lot of people becoming interested with, you know, about the US, whereas we didn't see that with Obama. Most people had a very high opinion of him. We do see that with Trump because everyone has made pick sides with Trump, globally. I mean, as you know, he is such a public persona and his Twitter is so wild. I think one of the good things to come out of 2020 is this awakening of criticism and of critical thinking being applied to big governmental bodies. That's my conclusion. What do you guys think?
You know, I think we have to find the silver linings to the clouds. There's no question. 2020 has been the year, and I think it's been 2016 to 2020 as a whole. It has been the year where we have realized that the media has not been giving us the whole story, and we are learning how to read in between the lines by and large. There's still a very diehard base, 20 solid plus percent, who will look at the New York Times as an authority, Washington Post, and they don't even appreciate it. But the vast, you know, a lot of people are now seeing the media manipulation. They're seeing how they're being manipulated. They're seeing social media manipulation, and they're seeing the downsides of big tech censorship, even if they at one point in time thought they supported it. When you start seeing people who otherwise supported big tech censorship, like Sacha Baron Cohen, getting censored, people start to realize that censorship is not good today just because it's on your side. You will be on the other end of the chopping block at some point, and people are realizing that.
Yeah, and I think just to echo what Kira said is that, yes, people have become aware of the deep state. That is a good thing. They've become aware of the FBI. You know, up until now, you know, they've had a, you know, very bland approving. So, oh, the FBI, they're fighting terrorism, they're fighting organized crime, they're doing all these great things. And suddenly they're seeing what the FBI really is. They're seeing what the CIA is all about. They're seeing what the judiciary is about. You know, they look at Sullivan and said, hey, I thought that when you go to a, you know, into a federal court, you know, you get some very wise Solomonic judge weighing the arguments on either side and then coming down with a first-rate balanced judicial decision. They say, no, this is a political hack who's sitting there presiding over a case. So, and now the people are going to look at elections and say, hey, the elections are stolen. I mean, I always thought, you know, people did all this counting meticulously and something. Yeah, no, they're stolen. People just, and so it's a good thing that people are suddenly realizing, well, that all these things that they've taken for granted, they shouldn't take for granted.
Well, the interesting thing is, like, specifically on the FBI and the CIA and intelligence communities, I remember, back in the first the Iraq War under George W, where people were saying at the time these expert reports are nonsense. There are no WMDs. At that time, I remember it was a minority of people were writing off as being a little loopy and being a little conspiratorial. And anybody talking about all the underhanded, nefarious things the FBI were doing, they were treated like marginalized individuals with extreme views who were conspiracy theorists, for lack of a better word. Now people just realize that the FBI is, corrupt, for lack of a better word, but it is an institution that does things that are not necessarily clean. And it is, as an institution, it's no better than its individuals, like a bank, like a store, whatever. And it is not a perfect or a sanctimonious institution just because of the letters that it have. And I think people now genuinely appreciate that. And the people who believe that are no longer marginalized as loonies who are believing anything. We have now really seen firsthand how these agencies, which are supposed to be almighty and powerful, can be weaponized in ways that are absolutely unhealthy, and people have seen it with their own eyes, and they're never going to forget it.
Just on the back of that, Viva, I also think that a great champion for unearthing and truth and putting it out there for people to see, of course, is Julian Assange. And I don't know if both of you agree or not, but I hope that one of the outcomes, whether Trump wins or loses, will be him pardoning Assange.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say the Julian Assange was it's an amazing thing, and nobody who pays attention to these things can really approve of what has happened to him. I know people say he jeopardized soldiers and he revealed national secrets. That's when the national secrets you're exposing are crimes against humanity. They're not supposed to remain secrets.
Yeah.
And so we'll see. I mean, it's the problem is, even if they pardon Julian Assange, his life has been stolen and he has been broken. But we'll see. It will see. And the theory was that if Trump wins, he'll be emboldened to pardon Assange, and if he loses, he'll do it to spite a lot of people. So
it is a very interesting. It is very interesting. I mean, one hopes that that Trump will actually do it, pardon Assange, pardon Edward Snowden, and then you just hope that somehow Assange will be able to get back to some kind of normal life. Yeah. But on the other hand, you have to worry about his own safety, because there are intelligence services around the world who have not forgiven him, and they may well be gunning for him. So you hope that he can walk out, go somewhere, go back to Australia or whatever, wherever he wants to live. But you still hope that he will actually survive, and that he will be able to live in security.
No, it's interesting, but we'll see. I mean, that is going to be a more prominent question, but it's going to be drowned out by the next month of election litigation.
Yeah, and just Viva, finally, what then are your predictions for the next couple of weeks? I mean, how long is this going to be dragged out? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. I mean, this is if there's going to be some movement, if there's going to be a recount, which might itself take a week or 2 weeks, it's got to get started sooner than later. It may all be academic, depending on what happens with the remaining votes, or it may become even more pressing depending on what happens. I don't know. I can't change my prediction now, because it's always easier to change your prediction when you see that one person in theory on the Electoral College is at 264. All they need is X. But I'm sticking to my original prediction, which at the very least was Trump will win the presidency. But as far as it's going to go, it's impossible to predict. And this year has been impossible to even conceive of, let alone predict. So I just know something incredible is in fact going to happen in the next 2 months. Who knows what it's going to be at this point? It could be a number. It could be multiple things.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Honestly, it's been fun.
Thank you very much, Viva.
My pleasure. It was nice to meet you too.
Yeah. So the next thing we should be looking out for is what your interview with Barnes. When is that, on Sunday?
That we're going to do another live streams. We're going to do live streams every Sunday unless something prohibits them. And the next videos I'm going to get out, I'm going to do like just a summary breakdown of the Michigan lawsuit so people can understand what's going on, a summary review of the Pennsylvania order in the same video because it's the same issue. And I'm going to be just trying to, myself follow and digest without getting sucked into what's the word? Not red herrings, but without being duped, tricked, or led down
wild geese chases.
Yeah, because I mean, there's going to be so much information coming out. It's a question of digesting the good information and really not getting lost on the bad. But I'll be following those lawsuits and the additional lawsuits that are going to come out. And you know what I should say? One thing I'm predicting: the hanging chat of the year 2000. Our equivalent is going to be the Sharpie Gate 2020. There is debate as to whether or not the Sharpies are in fact a legitimate concern on the ballots. But I'm foreseeing that there's going to be an issue about recounting and including any Sharpie ballot that was excluded, and that might be the determinant factor in one state.
Might be a game changer. Well, again, thank you so much, everyone at home. I'm going to put links down below so you can find Viva and his wonderful channel. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Gaggle. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys.